On the morning of April 18th, 1942, 16 American bombers prepared to do something that had never been done before, and that most experts believed was impossible. They were going to take off from the deck of an aircraft carrier, fly over 600 miles to Japan, drop their bombs on Tokyo, and then continue on toward China, because there was no way to land back on the carrier. The aircraft were land-based bombers. They had never been designed to operate from a ship. The runway available to them was 467 feet of pitching, rolling steel deck, a fraction of what these planes needed under normal conditions. For months earlier, Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. America was reeling. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. Japanese forces were advancing, seemingly unchecked, across the Pacific. Morale at home was shaken to its core. President Roosevelt wanted retaliation, something to prove that Japan itself was not untouchable, something to show the American people and the world that the United States could strike back. 16 bombers, 80 men, one impossible mission. Leading them was a man who had spent his entire career proving that the impossible was simply something nobody had tried hard enough yet. His name was Jimmy Doolittle. This is the story of the raid that changed the course of the Pacific War.
Another world, sky.
To understand why the Doolittle Raid happened, you have to understand the desperation of early 1942. On December 7th, 1941, Japan had launched a devastating surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Within 2 hours, the Japanese had sunk or damaged 19 American ships, destroyed over 300 aircraft, and killed more than 2,400 Americans. It was, at the time, the worst military disaster in American history. In the months that followed, the news only got worse. Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Singapore, considered an impregnable British fortress, fell in February 1942. American and Filipino forces in the Philippines were pushed back to the Bataan Peninsula, fighting a desperate, doomed defense. Japan appeared unstoppable. American morale was at its lowest point of the war. The public needed something, anything, to believe that the United States could fight back and could reach Japan itself. The problem was logistics. Japan was thousands of miles from any American base capable of launching a bombing raid. Conventional land-based bombers simply could not reach Tokyo and return. There was no air base close enough. The only way to strike Japan was from the sea. But carrier-based aircraft of the era, fighters and light dive bombers, didn't have the range or the payload to make a meaningful strike on Tokyo and survive. The solution came from a Navy officer named Captain Francis Lowe, who had an unusual idea. What if you put land-based Army bombers on an aircraft carrier? It seemed absurd at first. Army bombers were never designed for carrier operations. They were too large, too heavy, with wingspans that left almost no margin for error on a carrier deck. No one had ever attempted it. But the math suggested it might just be possible if you found exactly the right aircraft, stripped it down to save weight, and found exactly the right pilots. The mission was approved, and the man chosen to lead it had spent his entire life pushing aviation past what people believed was possible. James Harold Doolittle was already a legend in American aviation by 1942, though not primarily as a combat pilot. As a record setter, an engineer, and a man who treated flying as both a science and art. Born in Alameda, California in 1896, Doolittle had been flying since World War I, though he never saw combat in that war. What he became known for afterward was something different, pushing the boundaries of what aircraft and pilots could do. He held a doctorate in aeronautical science from MIT, one of the first people in the world to earn one. He set numerous speed records. He was the first pilot to perform an outside loop, a maneuver many aviation experts believed would tear an aircraft apart or kill the pilot from the stress of the inverted forces. Perhaps most significantly, in 1929, Doolittle made the first flight using only instruments, taking off, flying a complete circuit, and landing without ever looking outside the cockpit. It was one of the most important developments in the history of aviation safety, eventually making night and bad weather flying possible for every pilot who came after him. By 1942, Doolittle was 45 years old, older than most combat pilots, and technically more valuable to the Army Air Forces as an engineer and test pilot than as a mission commander. He had to fight for the right to lead the raid himself. His superiors wanted him to plan the mission and hand it off to a younger combat pilot. Doolittle refused to accept that arrangement. He had designed much of the mission's technical approach personally. The weight modifications to the B-25s, the takeoff procedures, the fuel calculations that would determine whether the crews lived or died. He insisted on leading the first aircraft off the carrier deck himself. Eventually, his superiors relented. The training that followed was intense and highly secretive. Crews practiced takeoffs from a runway marked to simulate the dimensions of a carrier deck, a fraction of what they were used to. Pilots practiced taking off in just a few hundred feet, gunning the engines to maximum power, releasing the brakes, and getting airborne before running out of deck. Many of the volunteer crews didn't know exactly what they had signed up for until weeks into training. They knew it was dangerous. They knew it was secret. Some were told only that it would be the most important mission of their lives. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers were selected and extensively modified, stripped of unnecessary weight, fitted with additional fuel tanks to extend their range, and equipped with fake tail guns made of broomsticks, painted black because the actual gun turrets had been removed to save weight. Before we continue, let's take a closer look at the aircraft that made this mission possible. The North American B-25 Mitchell, named after General Billy Mitchell, one of the earliest and most influential advocates of American air power. The B-25 was a medium bomber designed for operations from land bases. It was built for range, flexibility, and weapons capacity, but it was never intended to operate from an aircraft carrier. Its dimensions alone made the challenge seem impossible. A wingspan of 67 feet, 7 inches. A length of 52 feet, 11 inches. Powered by two Wright R-2600 Cyclone engines, each producing approximately 1,700 horsepower. The B-25 could reach speeds of around 272 miles per hour. Under normal conditions, the aircraft had a range of approximately 1,350 miles. But for the Doolittle Raid, the aircraft were extensively modified. Extra fuel capacity was added, unnecessary weight was removed, and equipment was stripped down wherever possible, all to extend their range far beyond their original design limits. The B-25 was capable of carrying up to 3,000 pounds of bombs, but the aircraft used for this mission carried a reduced bomb load in order to save weight and increase fuel efficiency. Each aircraft carried a 5-man crew, responsible for flying, navigating, bombing, and defending the aircraft during the mission. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers were modified, stripped down, and placed aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, an aircraft never designed for carrier operations, preparing for a mission that had never been attempted before. What followed would become one of the most daring aviation operations in military history. Now, let's get back to our story. The plan called for the USS Hornet, carrying the 16 B-25S, to sail to within 400 miles of Japan before launching the strike. At that distance, the bombers would have enough fuel to hit Tokyo and continue on to airfields in China, where they would land and refuel before returning to American-controlled territory. It was an enormously tight margin, 400 miles to the target, then continuing on to China, all on a fuel supply calculated down to the gallon, with no realistic option to turn back. On the morning of April 18, 1942, the plan fell apart before it had truly begun. The Hornet Task Force was spotted by a Japanese picket boat, a small fishing vessel pressed into naval reconnaissance service. The American ships sank the boat with naval gunfire, but not before its crew had radioed a warning back to Japan. The element of surprise was potentially compromised, and the task force was still over 600 miles from Tokyo, 200 miles farther than the mission had been planned for. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the task force, faced an agonizing decision: launch now at extreme range, with almost no margin for error and no realistic chance of reaching the planned airfields in China, or abort the entire mission. Halsey gave the order, launch immediately. For Doolittle's crews, this meant the mission had just become significantly more dangerous. The extra 200 miles would consume fuel they couldn't spare. Some crews would likely not make it to China at all. They might have to ditch in the ocean or crash land in Japanese-occupied territory. They launched anyway, one by one, beginning with Doolittle himself in the lead aircraft. The B-25S thundered down the pitching deck of the Hornet, fighting for every foot of runway as the ship rolled in heavy seas and lifted into the air. It was, by any measure, one of the most dangerous takeoffs in aviation history. A loaded medium bomber designed for thousands of feet of runway, launching from a deck barely 467 feet long, in rough ocean conditions, at extreme range from the target, with no possibility of return. All 16 aircraft made it off the deck successfully. They formed up loosely and turned west toward Japan. The bombers flew low over the Pacific, often just a few hundred feet above the waves, to avoid Japanese radar and aircraft detection. 5 hours after launch, they reached the Japanese coast. The crews split into their assigned targets: Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Each B-25 carried 4 bombs, a mix of high explosive and incendiary devices, targeting military and industrial installations. Because of the compromised launch and the resulting confusion in Japanese air defenses, most of the American bombers reached their targets with relatively light opposition. Anti-aircraft fire was present, but largely ineffective against aircraft flying low and fast. A small number of Japanese fighters rose to intercept, but the B-25's speed and evasive low-altitude flying made them difficult targets. In Tokyo itself, the psychological impact was immediate and enormous. The Japanese public had been told, repeatedly, that the home islands were invulnerable to attack, protected by distance, by the Imperial Navy, by the divine providence the government claimed for the nation. American bombers appearing in the skies over the capital, dropping bombs on military and industrial targets, shattered that narrative instantly. The military damage inflicted by the raid was, in purely tactical terms, modest. 16 bombers carrying a relatively light bomb load could not inflict catastrophic damage on a country the size of Japan. Some military and industrial facilities were hit. Some fires were started, but this was never the primary purpose of the mission. The purpose was psychological, on both sides of the Pacific. For Americans, devastated by months of bad news, the raid was electrifying. President Roosevelt, when asked by reporters where the bombers had launched from, gave a now-famous response. They had come from Shangri-La, a fictional mountain paradise from a popular novel, deliberately deflecting the question to protect operational secrecy. For Japan, the raid was a profound shock. It directly contributed to a shift in Japanese naval strategy, including the decision to extend Japan's defensive perimeter and engage the American fleet at Midway 2 months later, a battle that would become the turning point of the entire Pacific War. But for the 80 men who had flown the mission, the most dangerous part was just beginning. Because the mission had launched 200 miles farther from Japan than planned, every single B-25 was now critically short on fuel. None of the 16 aircraft made it to their intended airfields in China. 15 of the bombers either ran out of fuel and crash-landed, or the crews bailed out over China as their fuel ran dry, in darkness, over mountainous and unfamiliar terrain. One aircraft, dangerously low on fuel, diverted to the Soviet Union, where the crew was interned for over a year before eventually escaping to British-controlled Iran. Doolittle himself bailed out over China in heavy rain and darkness, landing in a rice paddy. He believed, in the immediate aftermath, that the mission had been an outright failure, that he had lost most of his aircraft and possibly many of his men for limited military gain. What followed was one of the most remarkable chapters of the entire raid: the rescue of the American airmen by Chinese civilians and soldiers. Across the regions where the crews came down, Chinese villagers, soldiers, and missionaries took enormous risks to hide feed, and guide the American airmen towards safety, away from areas controlled by Japanese forces. Communication was often impossible. Most airmen spoke no Chinese, and many of the people helping them spoke no English. But the help came anyway, repeatedly, from people who understood exactly what the consequences would be if they were caught. Of the 80 men who flew the mission, 69 eventually made it to safety, largely due to Chinese assistance. The cost to China itself was severe. In the months following the raid, Japanese forces conducted a brutal retaliatory campaign across the regions of China where the airmen had been assisted, a campaign that resulted in the deaths of an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians and soldiers. It remains one of the most devastating and least known human costs connected to any single American military operation of the war. Of the 80 Doolittle Raiders, 3 died during the mission itself, 2 drowned attempting to bail out over the China coast, and 1 was killed in a crash landing. 8 men were captured by Japanese forces in China. Of those 8, 3 were executed by the Japanese military in October 1942, and 1 died in captivity from disease and mistreatment. The remaining 4 survived years of brutal imprisonment until the war's end. Jimmy Doolittle, believing his mission had been a failure, was stunned when he returned to the United States to discover he was being hailed as a national hero. He was awarded the Medal of Honor and promoted 2 ranks, from lieutenant colonel directly to brigadier general, an extraordinarily rare jump that reflected just how significant his superiors understood the raid's impact to be. The Doolittle Raid is remembered today as one of the most audacious operations in American military history, not because of the damage it inflicted, which was militarily modest, but because of what it proved and what it triggered. It proved that Japan itself was not invulnerable. That message reached the Japanese public, the Japanese military command, and the American public simultaneously, with very different effects on each. For the Japanese military, the psychological blow contributed directly to the decision to pursue and destroy the American carrier fleet at Midway. A battle Admiral Yamamoto pushed for partly in response to the embarrassment of Tokyo being bombed. Midway, fought in June 1942, became the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War, where Japan lost 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers and a strategic initiative in the Pacific permanently shifted to the United States. For the American public, the raid provided the first genuine victory narrative of the Pacific War, a desperately needed morale boost at the lowest point of the conflict. The 80 men who flew the mission became known as the Doolittle Raiders, and for decades after the war, the surviving members held annual reunions, using a set of 79 silver goblets, each engraved with a Raider's name, that were turned upside down as each man passed away. The last surviving Raider, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Doolittle's own co-pilot on the lead aircraft, died in 2019 at the age of 103, the final living link to the mission. Jimmy Doolittle went on to a distinguished career commanding air forces in North Africa and Europe for the remainder of the war, eventually retiring as a lieutenant general. He died in 1993 at the age of 96. Having lived to see the mission he led become one of the most studied and celebrated operations in military history. 16 bombers, 80 men, 467 feet of pitching carrier deck. By any conventional military calculation, the Doolittle Raid should not have been attempted. The aircraft weren't designed for it. The range was barely sufficient even under ideal conditions, and the conditions were far from ideal. The men who flew it understood, going in, that many of them might not come home. They flew anyway. What they proved that morning over Tokyo mattered more than any bomb they dropped. They proved that distance and ocean and a supposedly invulnerable home island could not protect Japan from American resolve. They handed their country a victory at the exact moment it needed one most. And they paid for it. In lives lost over the China coast, in years of brutal captivity for those who were captured, and in a devastating cost borne by Chinese civilians who asked for nothing in return except the chance to help. It remains one of the great stories of courage and consequence in American military history. If you'd like to support this project, the link is in the description below. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. We'll see you on the next flight.